some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that what about the shower?
Introductory discussion on the ethical implications of a community.
Before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
More than 60 million people tune in to CSI every week for a look at the world of forensic science. But how accurate is the television show? What is it really like to be a forensic scientist? We talked with Bob Shaler, director of the forensics program and professor of biochemistry and molecular biology in Penn State's Eberly College of Science. Shaler worked as a criminalist at the Pittsburgh Crime Laboratory, served as the director of the New York City office of the chief medical examiner, and worked for the nation's first forensic DNA laboratory, the Life Codes Corporation. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, Shaler was charged with identifying the victims of the attack on the World Trade Center. He designed, organized, and implemented the DNA testing strategy that resulted in the identification of 1,592 of the more than 2,700 people who perished there. His account is detailed in his book, Who They Were, Inside the World Trade Center DNA Story. We asked Shaler about his 9/11 experiences, his thoughts on the CSI effect, and about his goal to make Penn State's the most comprehensive and rigorous scientific forensic program in the nation. Here's what he had to say. Robert Shaler, welcome to the conversation.
It's nice to see you again.
You have had, to say the least, an interesting career, which we're thankful to say led you here to Penn State. Give us kind of a career highlight.
Gee, I don't know where to start. It seems like it's been a long journey. It kind of started in Pittsburgh. I was working as assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Pharmacy, and I saw in the Pittsburgh Press, which no longer exists, an advertisement for forensic sleuthing classes being given by Pitt. So I took the classes. They were nighttime classes. They were taught by people in the crime laboratory, and all the classes took place at the crime laboratory. And that opened up a whole new vision of things for me. I didn't realize that that kind of work was available because it wasn't publicized much in those days. There was Quincy on television, but that was about it, and always was interested by it. So after that, I began working at nighttime in the Pittsburgh Crime Laboratory and teaching in the daytime at the university. Eventually, that led to a full-time job all day long at the crime laboratory. From there, I applied for a research grant, and I was granted a research grant. And that took me to Washington, D.C., where I worked with one of the Beltway bandits called the Aerospace Corporation. And there I was in charge of some forensic-related contracts, one of which was a bloodstain analysis contract, which eventually became the standard for the United States up until the time DNA took over. From there, I went to New York City, and the reason I got to New York City was because of a case I had worked when I was in Pittsburgh. It was a case involving someone in a murder case, and I was brought in by the defense and I got a chance to do some additional work, which was part of the research grant that I had been working on. And so I did some work, and the guy who was working for the prosecution, Dr. Alexander Weiner, saw the work that I had done, and he said, "This is new." So I went and testified as a defense expert, and Dr. Weiner eventually died. Dr. Weiner was a very famous person. He was one of the co-discoverers of the RH factor, and he had been in New York City since.
And the RH factor
is a factor for, if you RH positive or RH negative. And he had been working in New York City and was one of the all-time great forensic biologists, and he'd been there since the 1930s. He started that laboratory. So anyway, he had said to the chief medical examiner at the time that basically, if I'm not ever here, this is somebody you should look at. So Dr. Weiner died, and when I was in Washington, D.C., the medical examiners asked me if I'd be interested in interviewing for the job. So I came to New York and started working in New York City in 1978. That was many, many years I worked there. And then DNA came along, and some folks from the Life Codes Corporation came down to the medical examiner's office. We actually worked a case together while I was still in New York.
And we should say that Life Codes is really the world's first DNA forensic laboratory, DNA paternity testing laboratory.
Well, yes, it was also the first forensic laboratory in the United States. Even though it was a private company, there was still nobody in the United States doing it. In fact, we went to the FBI and sat down with the FBI to talk to them about it, and they basically blew us off. They didn't think it was going to work, but they very shortly after that got intimately involved in working to see that it would work. And the reason for that is because we were having successes. But this case in New York, we had a burglar who fell to his death, and there were bloodstains from the crime scene that we had matched up to this burglar. We also did DNA testing on it and proved that he was actually the burglar from his autopsy sample. So that was really the first United States case involving DNA, the RFLP typing type of DNA, which is different from another type of DNA typing. That led me to the Life Codes Corporation. I began working there in 1987 as their director of forensic biology. That position was a fun position because I got a chance to tour the United States and sort of be the huckster for forensic DNA typing, and I was the first person doing that. And we were talking to police agencies and district attorneys. We went to district attorneys' conferences, and cases started to come in. It was really just a marketing ploy, and to get cases in the door. And the cases we originally got were all cold cases. So we were really the first laboratory to really begin working cold cases. The prosecutors were more than willing to try to do things to solve.
Because everything else had failed.
Yeah, there was nothing left. And they were more than willing to try new things on old cases, but they weren't willing to try new things on current cases.
Interesting. Actually, there's a lot of things about the early days that seems a bit schizophrenic. The very first case that Life Codes was involved with that resulted in a prosecution was of an accused rapist by the name of Tommy Lee Andrews in Orlando, Florida.
Right.
He was convicted, and I'm just wondering, when you brought this to trial, how difficult was it to sell this new science to the prosecutors, to judges, to the public?
Florida was always very progressive when it came to DNA typing. And so they were willing to embrace it, the prosecutors down there. They needed something. They didn't have anything. And they sent us the case. We did the work. We got the match. And we ended up testifying to it. It was the first time it had ever been testified to in the United States. And I spent a great deal of my time trying to train the Life Code scientists how to testify in court. And we had built our whole testing regimen about things that we had learned from other cases and from my experiences in New York. And so we were really testing the waters for DNA typing. And we understood that if we failed, DNA typing might fail for the whole country, if not the world. The British were, at that time, were successfully using it in cases as well. We were really the only two groups that were doing it.
And in fact, a British scientist sort of invented this DNA testing technique, a guy by the name of Jeffries, and he came up with that term, DNA fingerprinting, which apparently scientists aren't all in agreement that it's a good term.
Well, everybody has their own ideas of how you should call it. I prefer DNA profiling. But Alec Jeffries came up with one way of doing it. And the way he did it was embraced by another United States company called Cellmark Diagnostics. It's called a multi-locus probe, where you saw multiple bands on a gel, and those multiple bands were likened to a ladder. We did single locus probes, where we were looking at one single region of the DNA at a time, and we did multiples of those. So there were really different philosophies on how to handle this. When we approached the FBI, and the FBI said basically thanks but no thanks, and they embarked on their own campaign, they began using single locus probes. But the interesting part of it is both Cellmark and Life Codes were trying to interest the DNA in doing it their way as sort of a marketing thing. Well, the FBI,
they were trying to influence the FBI?
Yeah, they wanted we all wanted the FBI to use our method. Well, that would be good for business. FBI, in their own way, basically say, not invented here, we're not going to use it. So they went off and did their own thing, and in my opinion, they ended up with a worse product. But it's a product that was endorsed by the entire law enforcement community, and so all forensic crime laboratories who were doing DNA typing used the FBI's method.
In England, where they first developed this technique, the government regulates DNA testing. That's not the case in the United States. That's surprising.
Well, yeah, that's the way they do business over there. Their forensic infrastructure is heavily involved with the government. In this country, we sort of have the government regulating it, but it's regulated by saying you can't have funding unless you do it this way. So in a sense, it's regulated, but really it's your choice to do it the way the government does it or not. But forensic laboratories have always been free to do things on their own. And although we have accreditation and certification, it's all voluntary. So a laboratory does not need to be accredited.
There have been 1,160 death penalties in the U.S. since 1973. Barry Scheck, who started the Innocence Project back in 1992, says that through their work, 238 post-conviction exonerations have been attributed to new DNA testing and evidence. Talk a little bit about this, because he says that forensic science has played a role in approximately 50% of wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA testing, which means that forensic testing is as you said, it's done by humans, and it's not always done well.
We have to look at those results with sort of a skeptical eye, if you will. 50% of the cases probably did involve forensic science, but what percentage of those 50% were the ones directly responsible for putting somebody in jail? There's always going to be other evidence. There's always going to be other testimony. The other part of this, and I'm not saying that there wasn't bad science in some of those cases, absolutely true there was. But the other part of it has to do with the advocacy system. The prosecutors present the scientist's work to the jury in a summation. And if you go back and look at these cases, some of these are very clearly influenced by how the prosecutor portrayed the science to the jury. So maybe the scientists say, we talk about a hair comparison, maybe the scientist says that the hair was consistent on the victim's body, was consistent with that of the defendant. He's not saying that it was the defendant's, but in summation, the prosecutor might say, you heard the scientist say that the defendant's hair was on her body. Now that's a misrepresentation of what the scientist said. But on the other hand, we do know, and if we read The Innocent Man by John Grisham, you know that there was testimony by scientists who completely and totally fabricated their testimony to favor the prosecution. So there's both sides of it.
And it sounds like it's a gullible public who hears the word science and forensic science and thinks that it's an infallible science.
That's true. That's true. When you put a scientist on the stand, the jury will believe that person. And that's why it's really critical for forensic scientists to understand that the words that they use are going to sway the jury one way or the other. And so you have to be unbiased not only in your work, but in the way you present your work in a court of law.
There's some 60 million Americans who watch these CSI type programs on television, and so we're all juries, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, we're all influenced by what we see. Tell us, separate the fact from the myth. What do we see on TV that really does happen, and what is sort of made up?
Well, first of all, it's all made up because it's a drama. And so the case itself is made up. But the science they use is sort of a hybridization of what's real and what's not. They may use a technology which is out there and could be used by people, and they deliberately try to get new technologies in so that people can see new things. But they might take that technology and have a little license with it and make it do things that it doesn't really do. An example would be a technology that we use on campus called Scene Vision 3D, which gives you a three-dimensional scanning using infrared to map the scene, if you will. Well, that gives you a computer program where you can go in and manipulate. It's like a virtual room. You can actually go in and see different areas of that crime scene. But what they did on CSI was they took that the instrument, and they put it onto a computer screen and made it do things that the real machine doesn't do. So they do things like that. And also, when I teach my students crime scene investigation and they're taking pictures of footprints, they're supposed to use tripods. And you'll see the CSI people walking around in very tailored looking outfits, which our students don't have, and they're just taking pictures with the camera, but they're not taking them in the proper way. And we have a very good time criticizing or critiquing CSI programs with our students.
Speaking of your students, when you came to Penn State, your mission really was to create the most rigorous and comprehensive forensics program for undergraduates in the country. There's lots of competition out there, but I want to know what sets your program apart from others, and what does it take to become, what kind of scientists are you trying to graduate?
Well, we're trying to graduate scientists who also understand and can apply science in the field to forensic problems. I came here with another individual, Dr. Mitchell Holland, and Mitch and I agreed that this program had to be grounded in science. And the reason for that is that when both of us were hiring people before we came to Penn State in our separate laboratories, we would bring people in with undergraduate degrees in chemistry or biology, or even master's degrees in forensic science, and we realized they didn't know how to use a balance. They didn't know how to do the basic manipulations that scientists are supposed to know how to do. So we vowed that our students would be scientists first and then forensic scientists second. And I think we've done that. I think we've accomplished that. The other part of the program is that because we both come from the applied arena, you have to be able to do the work as well as understand the science behind the work. So we have put together a program where students get to do the exact same things that are done in crime laboratories. And to that end, as an example, the FBI recently came to Penn State to interview our students. Actually, they brought our students down to the FBI. And we were the first university to have that opportunity because they have a number of positions available and they want to look at our students first because of the reputation that this program has. And we've only been around for 4 years.
You know, it's interesting to note that a lot of the working forensic scientists out there, and this is certainly going to change as we see more university programs, but most of them came without backgrounds. They didn't study forensic science in college. They might have been entomologists, pathologists, toxicologists, those sorts of things. So how quickly is the field changing now that there are these kinds of programs at the University of Mississippi, at Penn State, at Loyola in New Orleans, and popping up all over the place? Well,
forensic science programs have typically been started in criminal justice programs. And they'll bring in an ex-FBI person or an ex-detective or police investigator to teach forensic science. And maybe they'll bring in a crime lab person to teach the criminalistics course or the forensic science course. And maybe they'll get a non-majors course in chemistry. And so they put this curriculum together and they graduate with a degree in arts, but forensic science. Our program is in the College of Science, and that's exactly where it belongs. And in fact, the accreditation guidelines set down by the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and the name is called FEPAC, that group requires that students, if they're going to become accredited, must have the science background. And that started before we came to Penn State. That program was in existence before that. And then program's becoming a stronger program. I believe that there are 28 accredited forensic science programs in the country. Out of about 200 existing programs, we got our accreditation last year.
You joined in 1990 the New York City's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, where you established the largest forensic biology department in the United States, and then came 9/11. Mm-hmm. And your office was charged with leading the massive DNA effort to identify the victims of the World Trade Center attack. How prepared was your office for that job?
We weren't prepared. How can you prepare for something like that? You can't. We knew that it was our responsibility. The other thing we were concerned about was maybe someone was going to take it away from us, and we didn't want that either. We wanted to do it. I mean, New York was our place, and it was our friends and neighbors, the ones who died there, and we wanted to identify them. And so there was always in the back of my mind that either the FBI was going to come in or the New York State Police were going to come in and take this away from us. So we kind of jealously guarded that responsibility. So that was a very difficult time for us. When I started in 1990 in New York to set up this laboratory, we had 9 people. When I left New York, I had like 105 who were working for me. But that effort for the World Trade Center involved not just our office. I was working with 6 laboratories and New York State Police. So we had other laboratories who were doing specialized things for us, but all the identifications were made in the medical examiner's office.
Now, in all, you analyzed more than 20,000 samples, and there were 2,749 victims of the World Trade Center attacks. How many were you able to positively identify?
I think the number's around 1,600 now. They've identified a couple more since I've left New York City, around 1,600.
Which is about 58% of them.
Yeah.
Were you satisfied that you identified as many as humanly possible?
Well, yes and no. You're never satisfied if you haven't identified them all. Intellectually, that was impossible because a number of those poor people were incinerated. So their bones are just basically ash now, and there's no tissue with which to make an identification. So the 1,600, I think, is a good number. It's frustrating that you can't identify them all.
You said at one point in a book that you wrote, Who They Were Inside the World Trade Center DNA Story, that at times you came dangerously close to misidentifying people. Can you explain why?
Yeah. We were on the cutting edge of what was available at that time. We were using science in a way that it had never been used before. So there's always that opportunity to misuse the science. We would get a DNA profile from, let's say, a piece of tissue, and then we would match it up to somebody. And then we'd try to pull that piece of tissue out, and we'd realize that the tissue came from, say, an arm, and it should have come from a foot. So we had to go back and redo this. We also found out when people die together, their remains kind of mush together. And it's an awful thing to think about, but it's true. So if you identify tissue, the DNA from the tissue, it may be the tissue from another person. And the only way to really make that identification is to get into the bones and get the DNA out of the bones. And so we found those kinds of discrepancies as well. And plus, there were just mistakes made.
You also needed anti-mortem DNA. So, for instance, hair from a hairbrush that belonged to the victim, or a mouth swab from a close living relative. How eagerly did families of victims work with you? How challenging was that?
Working with the families was a true privilege. They turned out to be wonderful people, and they supported us from the beginning to the end. And I think one of the reasons they supported us was we were very open with them. Nothing was hidden from these families. We didn't tell them everything about the gory details, but when we had some issues, some quality issues, we pulled them in and we said, look, we have an issue. We're not going to make any identifications for the next month or two because we have a quality issue and we have to solve this. We found that there was some contamination in samples. We had to find the source of it, and we had to go back and reanalyze some of those samples. I'll give you an example of working with one family that I became very, very close to. Was the Cartier family. They lost their brother, and they almost lost a sister and a brother as well. They ran out of the buildings at the time. And but that family became sort of like a spokes group for a number of families. And we met with these folks every week. And it became important to them for us to be able to clarify what they had been reading in the newspaper. The reporters would report 12 bodies were found. And they would want to know, when are we going to...
my family member?
Yeah, exactly right. They wanted to know that. But the medical examiner's office would not report finding any bodies. We found remains, and they probably were not intact remains. So we could not report it as a body because it wasn't intact. So there was a semantic issue that had to be worked out. So the family started coming to us to get the information from the medical examiner's perspective, and they began to realize that we were really the only ones who were really being open with them.
And in fact, I found a 2003 op-ed that was written by a family member of one of the victims, and they said government officials could learn a lot about how to work with the victims' families simply by following Bob Shaler and his very capable team's example. Mr. Shaler does a great job of managing expectations. We might not always like hearing what he has to say, but his honest and forthright approach is appreciated. He doesn't say trust us. He provides facts and information on a timely basis, then engender trust and faith in his efforts. Had you ever heard that before?
No, it's the first time. This comes from the chief medical examiner, Dr. Charles Hirsch. This was his policy, and we embraced it, and we did everything we could to make sure that these families knew what was going on.
I want to read something else. This is in your book, Who They Were Inside the World Trade Center DNA Story. You describe what it was like working on the case, and you say, we often cried at our computers and at weekly meetings with the families. Sometimes we high-fived after identifying someone, or we'd steal away to an out-of-the-way corner to be alone, or simply to go for a walk to deal with our emotions. What toll did this take on you personally and on your staff? Because we're talking about 3.5 grueling years, lots of hours, and lots of emotion involved.
Yeah, you work with these families and they become sort of like your family. And so you really, really want to make these identifications so they can take their loved one home to a certain extent. And it's frustrating when you can't do that, or you'll have a DNA profile which you think, I know this is the right person, but you can't prove it to them. But when you do make that identification, it's just, wow. It's just inside of you, this emotion wells up, and you just kind of have to, walk away and let the tears flow. It's
Is this still
satisfying.
part of you?
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is. I still give lectures on campus about my experiences in PSU 16. And talk to the students about mass disasters, but talk about what we did for the World Trade Center. And there's times I still get choked up when I talk about certain instances. Yeah, it's hard to talk about.
We should add that while you are trying to identify these 2,700 plus victims of the World Trade Center attack, your normal workload, the usual homicide and sexual assault cases, were still coming in.
Sure. Luckily, murder and rape stopped in Manhattan for 2 weeks after the World Trade Centers. I guess there is a certain amount of humanity for those from those people as well. But yeah, the workload didn't stop. There were still court demands, and the judges cut us a break about forcing us to testify for a while. But they have, their calendars, and they have to. The criminal justice system has to keep rolling. So we had that as well. So what I did is I talked to my assistant director, Dr. Howard Baum, and I put him in charge of the daily activity of the laboratories, and I took over the World Trade Center so that we now had a split management in the office so that we could both do the work that we had to do.
2 months after the World Trade Center attack, American Airlines Flight 587 crashed in a residential neighborhood in Queens, New York.
Right.
So this gets lumped on top of all this other stuff.
That's right. I believe 265 people died on the plane or somewhere in that neighborhood. I remember listening to it was a Saturday morning, and I remember listening with Howard, and I were both standing in the office, and I said to Howard, I said, boy, I hope that crashed in Long Island someplace and not in Queens. And we both, yeah. And then the radio said that it was in Queens, and we both looked at each other and said, we can do this, because the system was set up. We were already doing a huge mass disaster project. To put another 2,000 pieces in to analyze seemed like something very trivial to us at that time. Had we not been working in the World Trade Center, it would have been disastrous for us, because they would have completely swamped the laboratory. But we had this system set up.
No, you didn't have the system set up initially, although I have to say that you had asked New York City officials to create kind of a mass fatality plan.
Yes.
Something that other things got in the way of.
That's true, and it wasn't just New York City, it was New York State. We had talked to the New York State Police about specific software for helping to identify victims using DNA, and just because we kind of felt that in New York, there's going to be a plane crash someday, or something's going to happen, or there's going to be an explosion. In 1993, somebody tried to blow up the World Trade Center before that, and they just didn't succeed. Well, you think, well, what if they do succeed? There's going to be fatalities, and so we weren't prepared for it. But nothing ever happened. It was never politically expedient enough to make it happen.
What enticed you after this experience that you've had? What enticed you to come to Penn State?
Well, I graduated from Penn State with my doctorate, so there was always the tie there. In 2004, I believe, somebody from the Alumni Association came down to Penn State, and I met with that person in my office, and she said, would you be willing to come back to Penn State and give a talk sometime? And I said, sure. Then she came back again and wanted to know if I'd come up and talk to students at our CSI camps that we have in the summertime. And so I did. I came up and I met with Dr. Spanier. We talked a little bit about forensic science. I asked him why Penn State didn't have a forensic science program, and he said, I've been thinking about that. Then I was given an alumni award from the university. And during that time, 2004, I believe, the university was looking into starting a forensic science program, and they were looking at the accreditation guidelines to see what courses were necessary, and they would ask me whether or not I agreed with that. But nobody had approached me about working here. When I came back to get my award, I met with Dr. Spanier again, and he asked me if I'd be willing to run the Penn State Forensic Science program, and I said, yeah. And at that time, it's kind of like the stars aligned. You know, I had had a heart attack.
In 2003?
In 2003.
In the midst, basically, of
Yep.
your trying to identify all of these victims.
That's right. And I had promised myself that when science could no longer identify people, then I was going to retire. It turns out that at that time, I was also eligible to retire from New York City. And then the offer comes to start a new forensic program to give me the opportunity to do the things and create students that I was not able to hire while I was in the city. So everything kind of came together. The job opportunity, the need for the program, the ending of the World Trade Center work, as far as I was concerned, and from the scientific perspective, and it worked out okay. In addition to that, in February 2005, I met with Mitch Holland. After I had accepted the position at Penn State, I met him at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences annual meeting. And
Mitch Holland is?
Dr. Holland is the associate director of the program and will take over for me when I leave. I said, you know, I have this opportunity to go to Penn State. Would you like to come with me? And that's how we got started.
It's an interesting program. In fact, in July of this past year, a television program featured your students who were broken up into teams and they had to solve a crime. Tell us a little bit about that TV program.
Well, the genesis of that was a committee that I was sitting on, American Bar Association committee. We were on biological evidence. And I was talking to that was a committee that had met for 2 years. And the last year was, I believe, 2004, 2003, somewhere in that neighborhood. And I mentioned that I was going to, it had been after 2005. I mentioned that one of the people there that I was going to be coming to Penn State and that I was planning to teach crime scene investigation. And this one attorney said, that sounds like a reality TV show. And then I went to a friend of mine who was in New York and was working with me at the medical examiner's office, who was also a consultant for Law and Order from a forensic perspective. And I said, you know, I told him the story about the attorney on the committee. He said, that's a good idea. He said, let me go talk to some people. So he went to some folks in William Morris agency, and they thought that was a great idea. He formed a company with another man called She-Rock Productions. And then I approached Dr. Spanier about the idea of having this, doing this on campus, and they agreed. And so I became basically they took my course and we televised the course. We had 6 episodes and it was broadcast on Discovery Channel.
And what was it like? I mean, what?
It was exhausting. I started teaching at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was 3 hours of lectures, and then we'd have like a laboratory in the afternoon, and we'd do a crime scene at night. And generally the crime scene took a couple of days. And each team had the identical crime scene. And whichever crime scene team did the best job, they won that contest for that crime scene. And they got an award.
Ice cream, I think.
Ice cream was one at one time they got an award, or pizza. The team that lost had to clean up the blood from the scene. So we had this reward basis thing, which turned out to be a lot of fun. The students then had to act out what they thought was the way the crime happened. So that became a riot as well.
And how close were they to figuring out what happened?
Well, they're pretty good. You know, we always make the scenes impossible to know. We want them to understand that they're not going to be able to recreate what actually happened because they weren't there. But we want them to use the science to guide them in the right direction. Now, they get some upfront information. They talk eyewitness testimonies or interviews of people who knew the decedents and that sort of thing. It's like a first officer's report. And so they do get some background information. So, but they don't know what they're up against when they get into the scene.
You know, one of the things we've learned from watching all of these CSI programs is how important the handling of DNA evidence is, and the trial of the century, O.J. Simpson's, I think, proved how you could get it wrong. Has that changed much? Are departments, police departments, more savvy about how to collect and preserve DNA evidence? Yeah,
they are. The O.J. Simpson case turned out, we all thought it was going to be a huge DNA case, and the prosecutors in that case really focused on the DNA. They focused on it to the extent that they presented DNA evidence to the jury in such a way they could never understand what DNA evidence was all about. And then, of course, we all saw the glove.
If it don't fit, you must have quit.
If it don't fit, you must have quit. But that case became a crime scene case. And what happens at a crime scene? Because there was some indications or suggestions made that the crime scene was planted, or parts of it were planted. So that became important. And then the other fallout from that case was the protecting DNA evidence and how you work with DNA in the laboratory, and you don't work with the suspect's DNA at the same time that you're working with the evidence from the crime scene. And you don't carry the suspect's DNA in your back pocket while you're working at a crime scene. So there was a lot of things about crime scenes that crop up. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to teach crime scene investigation instead of DNA analysis here, because I believe that there needs to be a scientific presence at the crime scene. And in the vast majority of cases in this country, there's not.
You know, at one time, and not so long ago, a murder victim, those first on the scene, if they'd see, you know, leaves and insects and all kinds of things on them, they would brush that away, only to know today that scientists can determine with reliability 2 hours the time from which the victim died, just from looking at insects.
That's true. Forensic entomology is a huge part, plays a huge role in some investigations. And in fact, Penn State has one of the internationally known forensic entomologists, Dr. Casey Kim. And he has an annual workshop in forensic entomology that he gives. It's a workshop that I took from him before I started teaching here.
You have 2 cottages that you use for your students. These are crime scene cottages. Tell us what they're like and what kinds of scenes you create there for students.
Well, they're great. They look like they belong to, they just look like crime scene houses. They are Victorian houses, 3 floors of Victorian houses that were built in the 1880s. And they've been on campus, I guess, in this area since that time. They've been moved from one part of the campus to the other, but they sit side by side. They're these imposing yellow houses that sit in the middle of this very modern Eberly College of Science. And I have as many as 4 crime scenes going in there at a time, and one crime scene involves a strangulation and duct taping of a young woman by a guy that she meets on the internet. And this is their first date, and you know, things happen, and she doesn't want to, he does, he gets angry. But it turns out that her jilted boyfriend is the one who actually kills her. So the students have to figure this out.
You're a scriptwriter here too.
I know. So the students have to figure that out, and they figure that out by looking at the fingerprints on the duct tape that are across her mouth, because they're different than the duct tape across her wrists and legs. Another scene has to do with looks like a double suicide, a homicide-suicide, where there's a woman hanging from one of the rooms, and she has slit wrists, and a ladder's knocked over. When you go into the bathroom, there's a guy lying in the bathroom, and there's a gun on the floor, and it looks like he shot himself like this. Well, it turns out it's a double homicide, but it looks like a homicide-suicide. The students have to figure that out based on the evidence that they find. There's another domestic dispute where a guy his son murders the stepmother. but the father and the son get a lawyer, so as police call, they're lawyered up, and so they're not talking. And the students have to figure out that it wasn't a domestic dispute, it was really a homicide. It wasn't an accident. They say it was an accident, she fell down the stairs. Well, it turns out they did a lot more than fall down the stairs. And then we have an outdoor scene where I have the students get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. We go out into the woods, and it turns out it's a place where a serial killer dumps bodies. And so I have a number of skulls, and we put these skulls and stuff out there, and they have to find the weapons that are there. And it all starts with a scenario of a missing doctor, and there's a love relationship the wife has with a neighbor. You know, it's one of these typical things that happens all the time.
Because of all of the CSI programs that we see on television, I think we all have kind of a skewed view of what the science can and cannot do. How tainted or influenced are your students by what they watch on television? So are they coming in here with unrealistic expectations?
Some of the students come in with unrealistic expectations, I think. What I found interesting is that they don't all watch CSI anymore. They're coming in because they really like the idea of forensic science, and maybe they have a forensic science class in high school. And maybe they're not CSI watchers. They know what CSI is, but they're coming in for another reason. Then there are the ones who come in because they watch CSI, and they want to be that person. Well, that person doesn't exist. People don't go to crime scenes in suits and high-heeled shoes. Or coat and tie. They don't, well, some detectives do, but generally the crime scene investigators don't. They don't make arrests, real crime scene investigators. They do testify in court, but they don't make the arrests. They don't do the investigations. They investigate the crime scene.
And in fact, what we often see on television are super scientists, one person who really does what 5 specialists might have done.
That's right, and that's exactly what CSI is. They have one person who does everything. And that doesn't happen. You're the scientist, you're an investigator, you're you make the arrest, and you testify in court. That person doesn't exist.
Police departments around the country, I'm wondering what kind of job opportunities are out there for your graduates. Does a police department have these different specialists? What would be a realistic number of forensic scientists in a police department, big or small?
Most police departments, especially small ones, don't have forensic scientists. These are people who go to police academies, and they're trained police officers. They'll also do the crime scene investigations. For the most part, our students are going to go to work in laboratories. They're going to, like I say earlier, the FBI is approaching our students now. We have several students who are working in the New York City Police Department crime laboratory doing drug analysis and that sort of thing. We have one person working in the Denver crime laboratory. So our students are primarily going out to work in laboratories, or we have some who've gone to graduate school, we have one in medical school, and we have 2 who want to be forensic nurses. So they're gone to nursing school now.
80%, I read, 80% of murders are solved, only 20% of burglaries. Can you talk a little bit about what that might mean to you in forensic science?
Yeah, I don't know if the number 80% of murders are solved is a correct one. I think it's more like 60%. Generally, murders are committed by people who know each other. They're usually not strangers. It's the ones where murders committed by a stranger, those are the ones they don't solve as much. Burglaries are committed by people who commit lots and lots of burglaries. Burglars also rape, they also murder. And so if you can catch the burglar, you're going to solve a lot of other crimes. So there's this big push in forensic DNA analysis to analyze DNA from property crimes. Car thefts, you get the DNA from where somebody touched the underside of the steering wheel or on the steering wheel or some other area in the car. Or you get DNA where somebody, maybe they touch, somebody puts their forehead against the window to look in the window of a house. Well, there's a lot of DNA on your forehead. And so you can swab that with a Q-tip and you can get that DNA and then you can analyze it. Now, but then you begin to show that many burglaries are committed by the same person. And you can do that by matching DNA, by matching fingerprints, by matching footprints. So you have all these different kinds of forensic evidence that can be used to show that one person is doing rather many crimes.
Well, speaking of car thieves, there's growing concern that CSI-type shows are making smarter criminals. a car thief, for example, might unload a cigarette butt disposal bin into a car after they've stolen it, so that there's all kinds of random DNA in this car. Are you concerned that these programs are making the job harder for detectives and those on law enforcement side?
I think there's something to be said about that. We know that burglars wear latex gloves so that they don't leave fingerprints or DNA. But interestingly enough, they'll leave the gloves at the scene. So the DNA and the fingerprint is still inside the glove. Some of them take it, I'm sure, but you find latex gloves at crime scenes. Burglars, people who commit crimes, for the most part, are not very smart when it comes to science. And I think during the emotion of doing what you're doing, unless you're really, really meticulous, you're going to leave something. I'm a firm believer of something which is called the Locard's exchange principle. And a scientist from the early 1900s named Edmund Locard is credited with saying every touch leaves a trace, which means that anytime you go someplace, there's going to be a piece of you there. It could be a shed hair. If you sneeze, it's going to be your sneeze stuff. If you touch something, it's going to be your fingerprint. There's going to be DNA in your fingerprint. It's there. And burglars also tend to maybe take a drink out of a soda can and they don't remember that their saliva is there. Or maybe they'll take a bite of a candy bar that somebody left there and that your saliva is there as well. And so it's really up to the ingenuity of the investigator to understand that DNA is there. You just have to find it.
Speaking of science, the National Academy of Science believes that what's really needed in this country are standards, accreditation, and really even a new government entity, the National Institute of Forensic Science. What kind of reforms do you think we need, and do you think Congress would be willing to fund something like a National Institute of Forensic Science? I
was on that committee that authored that report. And what the committee said is something that I'm passionate about. There should be a National Institute of Forensic Science. The forensic science community doesn't want it. The American Academy of Forensics or the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors agrees basically with what the committee report says, except they don't think that there needs to be a National Institute of Forensic Science. I don't know where these forensic scientists have been all the rest of their life when they've not been funded properly by the existing federal agencies that have bits and pieces of forensic science that they do fund. The forensic science community has not been funded properly by the federal government ever, especially the area that report talks about, and that's what we call experience-based forensic science. And this is hair comparisons, footwear comparisons, fingerprints, bullet comparisons, bite mark comparisons. These are areas of forensic science that a person's expertise and experience comes from years on the job. Now, let me give you an example. Let's say that your mother dies. You come home someday and your mother's lying in a pool of blood, and there's a footprint in blood there. And the person who does the analysis does it in a crime laboratory, and that person comes into court and testifies that footprint came from a particular person. And then he's asked, what percentage of all the footwear in this country could have made that? And he'll say, this man came from this shoe and no other shoe. And the question is, how do you know that? Have you looked at every footprint in the world? Have you examined all the Nike sneakers in the world that have that same tread of that particular size? And how do you know how often those little nicks and scratches that end up embedded on the sole of that shoe aren't on all shoes? The answer is, I don't know. But what this person is saying is, in my experience, I've never seen anything like that. Well, what is your experience? How many have you looked at? What the National Academy is saying, this may very well be true, but there's not the scientific basis to say that. So we need to find a way to put a probability figure on that. 1 out of a million, 1 out of a billion shoes would have made that mark.
And in fact, the American Bar Association wants all of this kind of information that you're talking about published so that prosecutors and defense attorneys and others can go back and look at what the standard is
It should
and
be.
the rigor.
It should be published. And the other problem is that over the years, all of this anecdotal work that has been done by forensic people has come out of forensic laboratories in some European universities. But for the most part, it's not been funded by anybody who has a direct interest in doing research of these sorts of things. Penn State never would have done forensic science research because there was no funding mechanism for it. The National Science Foundation, if you write a research grant to the National Science Foundation, if it has the word forensic in it, you're not going to get it. The National Institutes of Health doesn't care about forensic science. They don't even care about forensic medicine. They never fund those sort of things. So Penn State never would have had a forensic research program. The National Institute of Justice never had a budget to really fund these sort of things. So there are very, very few of these ever got funded. When DNA became popular, then DNA got a block of money from Congress to fund DNA because it's so important. It identifies people. Well, these other things identify people as well, but the funding's not there. And so these people who worked in crime laboratories couldn't get published in reputable scientific journals. So they started trade journals, and this gave the way that they could talk back and forth. The Journal of Forensic Identification or the ATF publication on firearms. But regular universities don't have these journals. They don't even consider them journals. They're trade journals. But that's how these people had to talk to in order to exchange information.
Well, how likely is Congress to spend the money to create the kind of agency that you and so many others seem to think we need?
I don't have any idea what the bent of Congress is. I think they should fund it. The FBI has its own mission. Department of Homeland Security has their own mission. National Institutes of Standards and Technology has their own mission. The NIJ has failed to perform in this realm. They're mainly concerned with law enforcement. Well, forensic science is just not law enforcement. It's involved in all areas of society when it comes to examining things and making comparisons. So it should be funded.
I want to go back for just a moment to the Innocence Project, which certainly has changed the debate in this country about the death penalty. Given what you know and your own experience, do you support capital punishment?
No. Well, yes and no. I support capital punishment. It depends on the crime. I don't believe people should be going around shooting police officers. I don't believe you should be killing little kids. But I think that there has to be a way of absolutely proving that that person did it. And I don't think we have the proper tools right now to show that.
Even with DNA evidence?
DNA evidence is very powerful, but it has to be probative DNA evidence. Just because DNA is there doesn't mean it has any relationship to the crime.
Where do you see all of this going? Where we can do things with DNA evidence that we couldn't do 2 years ago or 10 years ago. Where do you see the science evolving 10, 20 years from now?
Well, I think we'll be able to get DNA off of surfaces we've never been able to do it before. I'll give you an example of some futuristic work that's going on campus. Dr. Mark Shriver in the Anthropology Department is doing some DNA work where he can begin to look at facial features of someone. Stefan Schuster has sequenced the woolly mammoth. These are all potentially forensic related techniques. Well, Mark Shriver certainly is, because he's looking at physical characteristics of people based upon DNA. But the work done by Dr. Schuster tells us that we can now look at very, very fragmented DNA and begin to tell a story about it. Well, that's important because now you have DNA from a dead body, which has been buried for a long time and it's not in very good shape. It's very similar to the worst case scenario we saw in the World Trade Center work. So now we can begin to sequence that DNA and tell more about that person. I think that, and then the ability to get DNA off of other kinds of surfaces and to be able to look at smaller and smaller and smaller amounts of DNA. Maybe we can even begin to take fragmented DNA and put it back together again. And that way we'll be able to be able to say more things about that DNA. I think other areas of science are also really important as well. There's a new television program called Lie to Me, which talks about looking at facial way people express themselves, their physical expression of themselves. You can tell things about people. Amalgamating that kind of new philosophical or psychological aspects of an individual with with current meat and potatoes forensic science might be an interesting marriage. One of the things that we're working on in my laboratory is to be able to look at markers that define pain and suffering. So if you have markers that you can say, if this particular thing is expressed, it will only be expressed when somebody is aware of what is happening to them. And so someone dies in an automobile accident. Was the person cognizant? Did they suffer? Well, if that expression is there, then that person certainly had to be aware of what was going on, and they probably maybe knew they were dying or they knew they were in pain.
And you'd want to know that to know whether it was a drunk driver, or why would you want to know that?
In court, medical examiners are asked these questions. They don't have answers for them. There's no scientific hook that they can say, yeah, that person suffered. But they'll say, okay, they had 5 gunshot wounds to the chest. Yeah, he probably died instantly. Well, do we know that for sure? We don't.
I want to end with this. What is the most fascinating, exciting part of what you do? What keeps you getting up every morning to do this?
Sometimes it's hard to get up in the morning. Right now, my passion is students. I enjoy working with these kids, and I'm enjoying even more watching them go out into the world. From a forensic science perspective, from an academic perspective, my research interests are things that I'm interested in. And so that's what keeps me going.
Bob Shaler, thanks so much for talking with us.
It's my pleasure. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you for joining us for our conversation with Bob Shaler, Director of the Forensics Program at Penn State's Eberly College of Science. To learn more about Penn State's Forensic Science Program, visit us at conversations.psu.edu. And we hope to see you for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.